Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Debate in Lund, a classic in the academic world of Lund, I would dare to say now, after a full 5 years. We're doing this in English tonight. It's an international topic and an international panel to discuss issues of Africa. And of course, we realize that that's an immensely large subject, ridiculously large. We're not going to talk about everything African. That's totally not what we're doing tonight. But we have a few specific issues that we're going to be targeting on. The new scramble for Africa's resources, that's our headline. Is this a question of healthy development, or is it looting and colonization all over again? Where are we headed? What's the current state of those affairs? We have, as I mentioned, a really strong panel for you, but we are going to start this off right away. Just after mentioning that the host of this, of course, is the University of Lund, the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'd like to introduce now to you, on my right-hand side, Ellen Hillbom, who's an Africa researcher here at the university. Warm hand for Ellen. So we are going to ask Ellen to help us out with sort of framing some of the things we're going to be talking about, just to narrow it down just a little bit. We are ready to be entertaining, but not without substance. This is university, after all, so we're going to try to make it a little academic. So let me just ask you a few questions, Ellen, on the current state of affairs. First of all, currently we see big growth in Africa, big growth spurt, and many of the fastest growing economies in the world are African. I believe 7 out of 10 of the biggest current financial growth in the nations are there. Is this a new phenomenon, or is this something that we actually can see through history as well?
I think that we commonly understand Africa as a stagnating continent when it comes to economic development and growth. But if we see through history, at least the last 150 years, we've seen numerous growth spurts. We could take an example of gold and diamonds in South Africa in the late 19th century, or cocoa booms and busts in West Africa during the 20th century, and so on. So we have seen that. We have seen growth spurts, but we haven't seen growth spurts turning into development, sustainable economic development.
So that may be a new thing.
Hopefully that is a new thing, yes.
So, but this whole misconception, though, seems to be common still. Why is that? Are we just not up to date? Or why don't we have an accurate picture or image of what's going on?
Well, Africa is a very diverse continent, and we see so many things coming out of Africa. And there's only a few countries who are among these big growth spurt economies. And then we have other areas that are stagnating or even negative growth. So I think we need to start with understanding the diversity of Africa, and that there's different mechanisms driving growth in different economies.
Mm-hmm. So much of the current growth is due to a demand for natural resources, of course. Is this handled in an ethically decent way? Is there a new era of looting natural resources, or is it actually good furthering development?
I think that, again, it's very diverse, and we can find examples of both. We can find examples of terrible looting, and we have a big discussion on land grabbing, etc. But we can also find examples of legitimate foreign direct investments bringing new knowledge and new technology. So there is no one answer to that, and I think maybe the panel will testify to that later on.
We'll definitely ask them. What would you say are some of the greatest opportunities and challenges in this issue in Africa today?
I think some of the new things that we're seeing is that we're seeing capital flowing much more freely than we have in the past. We see a growing African middle class, which we didn't have before. We see diversification of economies to a larger extent. And one of the big potential opportunities could be that we have a very high population increase and growing population densities, and potentially that could mean that we would have cheap labor in the future on the African continent. But then that cheap labor has to be employed by someone, of course, for that to be a good development.
Mm-hmm. And can we see any signs on where that is going?
Well, there are more companies moving into Africa and using the cheap labor, but we also have big challenges of poor infrastructure and access to capital, etc. So I think that the jury is still a little bit out on that still.
Mm-hmm. But then again, I come back to this. Is this a neo-colonialistic process, or is it actually something that just offers new opportunity? You mentioned free-flowing capital, which is good, but that also means that large assets are now owned by foreign interests.
That is true, and that is, of course, a challenge for the African states to make sure that they are not just selling off, but actually being part of the development of their own natural resources. And something that's sort of turning up in the debate is, of course, that we have new interests coming in. We have China, we have India, we have other what we call South economies. Now, they have been around for a while, but I think what we are discovering now is that they are actually making a progress with their investments that the developed North is sort of a little bit jealous of, maybe, and we are waking up quite late to this new development.
Mm-hmm. So we have a stellar panel lined up here to ask some things. What are some things, or maybe just one thing that you care to find out from our panelists tonight?
Well, I guess that the topic is going to be the scramble, and I would very much like to hear this some examples of the diversity. If there is a looting or a development, if they could maybe give us examples of both cases, and what should we then look out for in order to make sure that we don't have looting, but rather development.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I invite you to take your seat there, and we'll have Ellen back for her expertise later. Now I would like to introduce our panel. First of all, we are one person short. Mr. Fredrik Segerfeldt caught ill, so he wasn't able to make it tonight. But I'm pretty sure that these three panelists will be able to fully cover for him. First of all, closest to me here is Mr. Nimo Bassi, who is the winner of the Right Livelihood Award for his work on covering the effects of the Nigerian oil industry. A warm hand for Nimo. Welcome. In the middle, Margaret C. Lee, who is a researcher of African issues and author of The 21st Century Scramble for Africa. And experienced reporter covering all African issues for Swedish daily Dagens Nyheter. This is Mr. Erik Esbjörnsson. I would also like to just right away extend a special welcome to the Swedish ambassador of Nigeria, Mr. Svante Kilander, who is with us here on the first row. If you just want to raise your hand and wave to everybody. Just because, you know, as we go on through the evening, we will take questions from you to the panelists, but maybe also to the ambassador if you were so inclined. Just so start thinking about your best questions already, so you know what sort of resources we have up here. First of all, before we go into any of the first questions, I just want to mention we have 4 pieces of wonderful art in the back here, and I just want to mention those. They're made in a technique called tinga tinga. By a Swedish researcher here at the university, Emily Johansson, who's worked with an African artist whose name is Joseph Mwaliombo, and they have worked to picture the effects of development in Africa on spot with the people who live there. So when we're done here, make sure to step up and have a look at these paintings. They're special, and I also know that Emily will be here to answer your questions about that if you're interested. So let's head into the issues of tonight's discussion. First of all, Nimo, tell us just a little bit more about your commitment and your work that led you up to the Right Livelihood Award. Just for those who are not completely familiar with your work, what sparked your engagement, and what are some of the things that you've been doing through this?
Well, I started out my adult life working as an architect, but I began to be involved in human rights campaigns in Nigeria because then Nigeria was under military dictatorship. And then along the line, I found that many of the human rights issues we're campaigning on were actually environmental justice issues, especially the degradation of the Niger Delta by oil corporations, the human rights abuses, including the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was killed 20 years ago today. And that really sparked my interest and built my commitment to confront all forces of destruction and those who would rather take resources and make profit and forget about the people and the environment.
What's the current state of affair today? I mean, a lot of things have happened, and a lot of people will claim that we're in a positive development state now. Would you agree?
Well, it depends on from which end of the pipe you are looking at the situation. Obviously, there are some positive changes. But when I look at the environment, the changes are getting even more desperate than they were before. The positive thing is that I could campaign without being thrown into jail. that wasn't possible some years ago. So that's definitely positive now.
That is very positive. And why has that become possible?
It's because the Nigerian society has become so much informed, and there's a groundswell of social movements, and people are really committed to justice. And even when we were under military dictatorship, we had a very strong media. And of course, everybody had learned how to survive under difficult circumstances. So it's actually maybe it's sensible for those who would like to replicate the abuses of the past not to do so. So there are different kinds of abuses now, but you take, for example, I mentioned Ken Saro-Wiwa. He was murdered by the state 20 years ago to suppress and appease to pacify the Ogoni people. But 20 years down the line, the people are still standing strong, demanding that their oil be left in the soil, that the mess be cleaned up. Otherwise, nobody would think of reopening the oil wells, for example. So that the resilience of the people is really at play.
Well, I'm going to ask the same question to Margaret. Can you tell us just a little bit about your commitment and where it started for you professionally and where you're at today with your work?
Well, I actually started as an undergraduate student. I went to a college called Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, and I became very active in the anti-apartheid movement, the liberation of African countries, particularly in Southern Africa. And that took me on to graduate school to work basically in the area of regional integration, the attempt by the countries of Southern Africa to integrate their economies. And after a second book working on that subject, I realized that there were a lot of new actors in Africa. And ultimately, I began to look at the role of China as well as the traditional actors that had been looting Africa for some time. I take the position really that this is not a new scramble for Africa. This is a continuation of the scramble from the 19th century when the Europeans first colonized Africa. It continued during the Cold War. And so what we're just seeing now is a continuation of that. It's more visible now more than ever, and specifically the difference is that the African leaders themselves are highly involved in this scramble, which makes it really a sad situation for all of us.
We're going to develop that a little further on as well. But let's just also get acquainted with Erik Esbjörnsson, Swedish reporter turned big lover of Africa. How did that come about?
Well, I was a big lover of Africa before I turned Swedish reporter.
It goes way back.
Yeah, well, I guess the foundation is my grandmother was born in Congo because her father was working on the river, and so that's the foundation. But then the interest grew when I was young, and I did development studies and political science here in Lund, actually, before moving into journalism. So, and then since 5 years, I'm based in Nairobi.
But you travel all over the continent for your work, though.
Sub-Saharan Africa, mostly.
Sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long-going debate whether North Africa is. I mean, it's definitely part of Africa, but it's proven to be easier to see it as a part of an extended part of the Middle East, basically. But Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm traveling quite a lot across the continent. Yeah.
And are you staying? Is this going to be your home forever? What's your?
Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah. No, it's. I'm sure that many of you have read some of Erik's work, but it's absolutely top class, and I hope that those of you who read Swedish newspapers follow him at Dagens Nyheter. You touched briefly on the geography issue, as we did with Ellen. It's so hard to. You said the North Africa can be an extended part of the Middle East. So does that mean that some of the issues that we are going to discuss tonight really aren't an issue with Morocco, with Libya, with Algeria?
I mean, it's really divided because if you ask anyone in North Africa, they're going to say they're part of Africa as well, you know. And a lot of, I mean, if you look at the African Union, for example, it's definitely both Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. But then you also have a lot of links. For example, the Arab Spring was more of a Middle Eastern issue in a sense, you know. So the links goes both ways, and sometimes you have to decide to draw the line somewhere. And we are gonna generalize anyway, right?
We have to.
Yeah.
We have an hour, so we're gonna have to.
So it's. I would say Sudan is the most tricky of them all.
Or most difficult to classify.
Yeah.
Would you agree, Nimo?
Well, you know, this is a very tricky issue, and unfortunately, we have the stretch, the Sahara Desert, that kind of makes communication a bit difficult between Northern Africa and other countries below. But you know, it's one organic whole, and the issues are all intertwined. And of course, geography has always been very difficult for Africa because the partition of Africa in 1884, 1885 in Berlin was very arbitrary. I know the lines, so we like to think about divisions and separations, but otherwise, Africa is one whole.
So let's talk about colonialism then and now. What are the strongest indicators that we're actually seeing a healthy development now, and that we're just not seeing land grabbing? Can we start on the positive side? What would you say, Margaret?
In terms of development, I think that we have to be really careful with respect to economic growth and actually economic development, so that we're seeing the African economy, some of them growing tremendously. But the question is, are we really seeing development? And when we talk about development in Africa, we have to keep in mind that development means that people's lives are changing. And so it's very difficult to put a positive spin on the fact that for the majority of people, even though you have economic growth, a lot of people are still suffering tremendously because that growth is not trickling down, and a lot of the leaders are using that money for their own benefit. And
But
so
Ellen mentioned that there's a growing middle class. That's not also true, though?
there's a growing middle class, but it's a very small middle class. I mean, definitely you have a middle class in South Africa, and certainly in most of the countries you have leaders who are at the top who work with the government, who clearly have wealth stemming from especially this current looting of Africa. But it's specific countries that you're really having a growing middle class. And in many respects, because of the wealth that's growing out of the natural resource scramble, the governments are not concerned about necessarily that middle class because they know that they can get election money from people like countries like China and other entities that are willing to support the elections to keep them in power. So I wish I could be a little bit more optimistic, but there still exists a lot of problems growing out of the fact that the resource money is not being used to actually build new homes, give people jobs, and security.
So it sounds like a two-level corruption, sort of. So the money goes into the leadership, who will use them to stay in power, who will then again get that money from the outside to have it politically stable. So that money goes around. Does that correspond to your view as well?
Well, you have a capital flight as well, going out of the continent, obviously. I mean, but on the topic of the middle class is interesting because a couple of years ago there was a big discussion. A lot of the narrative changed very rapidly to the whole Africa rising. It was a lot in the media, and most of it came from a study from the African Development Bank showing that now we have 350 million middle class people in Africa, and it caught many by surprise who are in Africa. And that's kind of depending on how you define the middle class, because we think of middle class as a Volvo, a dog, a small house in the suburb. I mean, that's not the middle class. There are some small amounts of people coming back. We no longer talk so much about brain drain, which was a big topic 15 years ago.
People
now,
migrating, with the best educated people would leave? Or
yeah, now there is a small amount of brain gain, actually, people returning, but that's more related to poor prospects in Europe, because if you have a good degree from a university in the States or in Europe, if you stayed before, maybe you actually want to go back to make a buck back home. But the real middle class is the people who maybe bought a chicken a month for the family, you know, and now they can afford to buy a chicken a week instead. So it's like very small levels of consumption, but I never use the word middle class for that reason, because is it the global context or is it an African or even a Kenyan, for example?
It will be journalistically misleading to talk about it?
Yeah, because we have so many connotations already. You know, we already think, we refer to a specific kind of middle class. I would say there's a growing consumer class, but yes. Nestlé, they just pulled out basically from East Africa in July, saying we are losing money and we don't see any prospects here. And they made the mistake when they came to Africa thinking they could just sell loads of Snicker bars, you name it. But Nigerian and South African companies, they know what they are talking about. So they are way better at targeting this low-level consumption. And that's definitely growing. But it's from so low levels, so you can't really talk about massive amounts of money.
Right. But still, 7 out of the 10 fastest growing nation economies in the world are now African. What will that mean in a 5 to 10 year perspective, you think? Nimo, if you care to start.
I think the whole concept of economic growth needs to be re-examined. To start with, the gross domestic product as a measure is very faulty. What was the origin of the GDP? Where did it all start from? What was the purpose of developing that basis of measuring economic development? It wasn't really meant to show, I think, it wasn't really meant to show how much a country was producing or what were the products. It was a kind of showing who was superior to who. But that was a post-World War invention, more or less, Second World War invention. And really, a professor in South Africa has written a book called The Gross Domestic Problem, and I think this is really the definition of GDP. It gives a very false impression about, last year Nigeria rebased its economy, the basis of the GDP, and suddenly it was the biggest economy in Africa. So it's a bit of fiction that is not rooted in reality. So we really need to, I think, for me, what is important is what is the level of well-being of citizens of any nation? What are the social services available? What's the space for people to grow to live in dignity and grow to the best of their capacity and ability? Not which country has 6% growth per year. And I think also sometimes this is orchestrated by those who want to exploit the countries in Africa. For example, if you're said to be a highly fast-growing economy, then you could be tricked, in a sense, to say, okay, this economy is growing fast, so now maybe you are more credit-worthy, so you could go to the World Bank or the IMF and take some loans, and then you become more indebted, and you get into the debt trap. It's all about, it's a manipulation, a global kind of level manipulation going on. So we need to really take it with a pinch of salt when somebody says Africa is rising. Rising on what basis? The fact that Africa maybe is rising, we have to determine and say on what basis, rising to where, rising from what, not just some kind of headline or the newspaper, The Economist or Time Magazine or so, where Africa is rising. This doesn't really hold substance. And the fact of the middle class, actually, as he said, I'm not a fan of saying somebody is a low class or a middle class. We're seeing workers, people who are working, reproducing, making things. And we're seeing that labor is dispensed of by capital, really. Because the poor laborers who work to produce things, the miners, in Maracana, for example, in South Africa, they produce all those minerals, but they can't afford the luxury goods. So who is really productive and who is doing the work? This is the issue, and this is why also at environmental level, all the costs for petroleum products are externalized on the poor people and the environment. And then we're looking at them also and expecting them to become consumer of luxury goods. It's not going to happen unless we remove the fangs of these vampires from our necks.
And how do we do that?
Mass action is when it's going to be. Mass solidarity from across the world. The power is in the people, not in the corporations. And we've seen examples.
Well, keep on talking.
For example, okay. One of the most inspiring examples there are many examples in Latin America where people march for days, for months to express their political position and then to make changes. We've got some really inspiring governments in Latin America that surprised us by turning the other way and still depend on extractivism. I mean, we saw what happened in Venezuela, even in Bolivia, beloved Bolivia, going the world extractivist way. So politicians have really kind of raised hopes and then they dash the hopes. But in Africa, my best example of people power is Ogoniland. When in 1993, the Ogoni people stood together and said, we don't want shale in our territory because of the depth of pollution, and we want our environment to be cleaned up. And they said, no more oil from Ogoniland. And since 1993, till now. At that time, in one particular village, there was the oil field had up to 500 million barrels of crude oil. That's in just one location. But from 1993 till now, not one drop of oil has been extracted from Ogoni people. That's people power. And the environment is beginning to recover by itself. Although it's going to take a lifetime to clean it. But if they hadn't stood up when they did, I sure that they think what Ogoni land would look like today.
So really this whole way of measuring economy is not really relevant. I mean, it could just as well be an effect of attracting even more capital into Africa. That's just a way of saying, look, we're growing. You should put even more money, more resources, and hence more looting. There's a risk.
That's exactly what's happening. It's very complicated. There's a book by Tom Burgess, if you really want to understand what's happening in Africa. It's entitled Looting of Africa. And he talks about, for example, some of you may have heard of Sampa in Queensway. Sampa was recently arrested in Beijing, but he has been involved in a lot of illegal activities with the Angolan government. Angola is one of the wealthiest countries on the continent, and it has no need for any type of external financial assistance. But because there's a group centered around the president that pretty much takes the money from the oil and builds up their wealth. In fact, President Dos Santos' daughter was recently said to be the first female billionaire in Africa. And so when you look at some of the corruption and the looting, unfortunately, it's not trickling down, like I said, to the people. So people are investing. And you have to be careful with what you're talking about investing. One of the issues right now, even with Angola, is that the concern for Angola is that the Chinese have been bartering. They have not been investing in Angola. They've been exchanging infrastructure development for oil. And now that China's economy is declining, there's a concern as to what's going to happen to Angola with respect to the infrastructural development. So we have to really be clear in terms of each country what type of looting is taking place and what agreements are being made.
And why is that sort of trade, that sort of bartering, as you mentioned, why is that problematic? Explain that more.
Well, if you call yourself, one of the major problems with Africa is that infrastructure has not been focused on. And the infrastructure that exists in most African countries now was built during colonial rule. And the infrastructure was designed to get resources out of Africa. So Africa is in great need of infrastructural development. So if you have a situation where in Angola, for example, the first $2 million that was given to the Angolan government for infrastructure development, 70% of all contracts went to the Chinese. Only 30% were given to Angolans. So if China's economy is declining and they're not able to continue with the infrastructure development, then that means that people will suffer, and the roads that have been promised to be built, the railroad tracks that are being laid since the war and all that kind of stuff, people will continue to have difficulty getting to the market and moving around the country.
So the local economy really won't flourish from that at all?
No, it won't. But getting back to the whole question of the middle class, I think one thing that has happened, which I talk about in my recent book, is that at the level of what we call globalization from below, people have improved their living situation to a certain extent, namely with cheap Chinese goods flooding Africa. Africans have been able to buy things that historically they were never able to buy, or they had to buy them secondhand. Now, very often, those goods are not very, they don't last, but many people feel that they are better off to some extent. The only problem is that in the informal economy, where most people are employed, these cheap Chinese goods are competing with local entrepreneurs, and so they're being put out of business. And so when you talk about what's happening in Africa now, you really need to look on the ground and see the dynamics. In fact, in Kenya a few years ago, there was a protest against the Chinese where the informal traders shut down Nairobi, and they argued the Chinese need to stay in the field of construction and leave us alone in the informal economy, allow us to sell our goods so we can continue to live.
Well, China is often mentioned in this. Can you give us the scoop on that a little bit? I mean, is China really the most important or the only important actor as far as coming in, buying strong, big resources, investing, grabbing land?
I mean, sometimes I can feel that when it's China is land grabbing, when it's Western companies is foreign direct investment, but it might be the same thing, you know. So. And it goes both the opinion up here in Europe, but also in Africa. Like, I mean, it's very mixed. Some people love to hate the West. Other people are very skeptical to China. And yeah, you do see Chinese workers, even EU-funded highways now being built by Chinese. But that's basically because European companies can't compete for the contracts, and there are not big enough companies in Kenya, for example, that can take on like 3 different highway projects at the same time, basically. You know,
so there's
like
no competition.
No,
is that what you're saying?
Well, there is, but you can't really compete with what China are offering. And then you have some Chinese companies can produce stellar highways, really good quality and stuff. Other companies, I mean, we had a stretch from Nairobi to Arusha in Tanzania. It's a 4-hour drive basically, and they had to tear up 200 kilometers because it didn't last more than a year. But it also means that they had to tear it up and redo it because otherwise they won't be certified for another project later on. So they are actually trying, some of them, but I mean, there are so many actors, you know, but some of the big construction companies, yes, they see more projects ahead, so they try to make a good impression. But otherwise in society, in Kenya, for example, the Chinese kind of stick to themselves, you know. You don't, I mean, you see a lot of Europeans, and also Nairobi is like a regional capital, you know. It's a hub, one of the big hubs of Africa. So you have thousands of South Sudanese people, you have Ugandans, you have Congolese, you have hundreds of thousands or millions of Somalis, you know. But you see them way more than you see the Chinese. They don't interact as much with the rest.
We are going to open the floor for questions in case you were interested. If so, raise your hand high. This is not raising your hand. This is raising your hand. Yes, gentleman in the back. We're going to get a microphone to you right there. Please introduce yourself, sir, and address your question to whoever you like.
I think my question is actually to the whole panel. My name is Felix Nogo, and I'm a political scientist. Not a student, though. My question is actually in regards to the comment about the scramble in Africa. I'm just wondering, how would you describe a real growth in other places? If all growth are considered scramble, how would you describe a real growth?
I think Nemo might want to start because you wanted to revolt with the whole concept.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think it's really a scrambling form of development. But really, seriously, the scramble for Africa is more than just a grabbing of resources, it's a grabbing of the continent. And it's not just physical, it's also atmospheric. In terms of, if you look at climate change, European corporations and nations are polluting right here in Europe, but they're buying up trees and forests in Africa under the guise that those can offset the pollution going on in Europe. I mean, this is grabbing also because when you do that, you are keeping out the forest from the rich of the people, you are displacing communities, you are depriving people of using their natural resources just because you see trees only as carbon stocks. I mean, this is incredible. I look at the forest, I see trees, I see human beings, I see animals, I see flowers, but most European countries and North America, they see trees as carbon stocks. Trees in Africa, maybe not trees in Europe. And this is ridiculous because this is real resource grabbing. It's resource corruption. Corruption is not just about financial transaction. When you misuse resources, you misuse the gifts of nature. you are really corrupting Mother Earth. And this, to me, this is a very serious crime. But in terms of going back to the question, the development going on, I mean, the infrastructure is very, as you rightly described it. If you look at the map of Africa, the infrastructure map of Africa, you see that the railway lines, the highways, they're all starting from either a mining field or somewhere they're going to start there. They go to the seaports to go to Europe or go somewhere else. So the whole thing was wired for exploitation. And the pattern is continuing now.
Yes.
Even the program for infrastructural development for Africa by the African Union is still the same pattern. Of course, the Chinese are the big players right now, but the setup for further exploitation and grabbing on resources is being solidified, is being expanded. So except something gives, Africa, unfortunately, remains a place to be exploited. And if global warming goes on without being checked, we may soon have Africa without Africans. And this is what I'm afraid of, because if global temperatures increase on the way we're going by 2 degrees, it will be 3 degrees in Africa. 4 degrees globally will be 6 degrees in Africa. Nobody will be able to survive that. I heard one interesting analysis this morning at a seminar that it will be a positive economic growth for Sweden, because then you can have a longer planting season. You could plant pawpaw and pineapples and oranges here that you never had before. So global warming is a catastrophe for Africa, but it could be opportunities for Scandinavian countries. I think that was very interesting for me to think about.
I always like to think about that when it gets November cold too, but I realize that's not politically correct necessarily to do that. But yes, I have that thought has crossed my mind as well. Margaret, would you care to comment on the same question from?
Did I understand you to ask about economic growth?
Yes.
And could you please repeat exactly what you?
You described growth, or rather, three of you described growth right now in Africa as a scramble. And I was wondering what a real growth would look like, because because in India, what is happening in India is very similar to what is happening in Africa, and India is considered growth. So I just want to understand what your take on that is.
Yeah. I think basically we need to understand that when you talk about economic growth, you can talk about GDP. You know, you can talk about, indeed, that Africa economically, as indicated, that has some of the fastest growing economies in the world. But when you talk about development, you're talking about a quality of life. You're talking about building, if a company is serious about development in Africa, they will build a company, a greenfield company, and employ people. That's what we call economic development, where people are actually employed, they make money, and they're able to buy goods. When you talk about economic development, you're talking about in South Africa, where people who live in horrible shacks, you're actually transforming their lives by building little houses for them to live in. That's economic development, not necessarily economic growth. And what we're seeing in Africa is that while you have economic growth, Africa is not experiencing economic development. Many of the areas that are being built by the Chinese, for example, and I'm not anti-Chinese, I'm just using China as an example, because China is doing things that no other country has been willing to do. Why? Probably because they don't have a democratic situation, and so they're able to take money. And, you know, when a minister calls and says, we need X, Y, and Z, they're able to send that, you know, a company over immediately, versus India, who is also a scrambler in Africa. They are more democratic, so they have to go through a lot of stages, similarly in the United States. But when we talk about development, we're talking about education, increasing the quality of people's lives. And that's what is missing right now with this growth. And again, I repeat, the difference between the 19th century scramble, even the 20th century scramble during the Cold War, is that the African leaders are allowing this to happen. They are spearheading this scramble. Without African leaders, there's no way that the Chinese, the US, any country can come in and take out the resources at the rate these resources are being taken out.
That's somewhat depressing to hear. I turn to Erik for possibly a different view.
I do agree. I agree to some part with the fact that the growth level, as we know it, is clearly not enough to measure progress. And the first step would be to move over to median income, at least, like not the average, but the median. What is the most common income in the country? And then at least you get a sense of. Because otherwise, it's completely irrelevant to a company even moving in to find consumers if all the money is within the president's family, for example. But if you see other progress, yes, health levels, I dare to say that I don't think there's a single country in Africa that hasn't had an improvement in health in the last 15 years, and quite big improvements as well. And then you have, I would like to mention the Mo Ibrahim Index, this Sudanese telecom billionaire. He has identified, as you say, leadership as a major obstacle, and he has been trying to encourage good leadership. And so he's both giving out the Mo Ibrahim Award to progressive leaders. It has been called the No Ibrahim Award because they haven't found any candidates for a couple of years. until this year, actually, when Poham was in Namibia got it, for example. And I think we are focusing too much about who's getting this, whatever. But they also have the Mo Ibrahim Index, which is quite interesting because he's trying from an African perspective to bring in other parameters of progress, like political participation, education levels, yes, democratic development, reform in other aspects than just GDP growth, because clearly it's gonna fool you a lot if you only look at the economy. But it's also, there's a reason all this came up 4 or 5 years ago, because after 2008, 2009, the euro crisis hadn't even started then. It was still a big cloud on the horizon, but clearly there was a need to show one destination for money, So I would say it's not a coincidence that the Africa Rising narrative became very popular around 2011 because of that, basically. But still, yeah, there are countries that should be mentioned, like Botswana, Namibia. You have all the island nations, basically, and even in East Africa, it's not. Yeah, I have my opinions on Rwanda, but still, they are showing development. Uganda as well, Tanzania. But yeah, there are massive problems. Also, we shouldn't be naive about.
Since we are debating, may I just interrupt here?
Oh, I love that.
I really have to challenge your statement about there's not one country in Africa that has not experienced health improvement in the last 15 years. Zimbabwe has experienced the worst decline imaginable. And I think we have to be very careful. We have to generalize at times about Africa. But in terms of health, education, and certain other social welfare issues, I think we have to look at each individual country. Zimbabwe once had, second only to South Africa, the best healthcare system on the entire continent. Now it is absolutely devastated.
Okay, I stand corrected on Zimbabwe. That's a unique state failure in modern time. But malaria deaths, and also research are going forward a lot. HIV levels are stabilizing, tuberculosis improving, polio has been eradicated this year from the continent. So yeah, there are improvements still in health, at least.
I'm curious to hear more about the political aspect of things. And since we have Svante Schilander in the room, our Swedish ambassador to Nigeria, we're going to get a microphone up to Svante in the very front row. I'm just going to ask you, Svante, what's your take after a little over 3 years as ambassador of Nigeria? What's the current health level of the political work from your perspective? Are we making political progress? Are we completely burned down here by corruption? What's your take?
In Nigeria?
Yes.
Well, I think what is happening now in Nigeria is we had an election half a year ago, or in March, 2015, and this election proved to be an energizer for the system in Nigeria. And I think also I shouldn't say a model for other countries because it's very difficult to speak about models like that, but it is a fact that the Nigerian elections was an energizer, in my view.
What sort of electoratory participation were we looking at there?
You mean percentage? I don't remember, but the satisfaction among the voters was noticeable after the elections with the result, and the way the president conceded was rather impressive.
Nimo, do you share that view from your Nigerian perspective?
I think the most impressive thing was the fact that former President Jonathan conceded defeat even before the results were fully announced. That was quite remarkable. Yes, let's be diplomatic. Well,
if you care to oppose the view, you can.
No. I mean, I agree with him. That's why I singled out. That singular act was very remarkable. That was the first time we got a thing like that. President Buhari had lost election 3 times. He never congratulated the winner to start with. But so he won this time, and the man who lost conceded and congratulated him before the results were announced. That was great. And that's why President Jonathan is now going around African countries observing elections and making, especially Tanzania and other places. And that's good to see, this positive signal, yes.
Yeah, I think also that the people, the electorate, were satisfied with the result of the elections also. I mean, this is not always the case. One would say some who were disadvantaged of a result would say this is not a fair election. I did not hear this kind of remarks, many of them at least, I did not hear. But so the result, the election process and the result of the elections were some kind of stabilizer, I would say. We are also thinking sometimes what would have happened if President Jonathan would have stayed on. I mean, the positive, the energy, the positive feelings in Nigeria, which we after all feel now, would not have been there, simply.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Looking to ask you as well about regulation. I mean, there's a balance here between what the corporate world can do and what the political world can do. And you can regulate. You can say, you can just make a decision. These things just cannot be sold. There's always a moral limitation. What can you sell? Can you sell a water well? That's generally going to be considered offensive almost anywhere in the world to sell a water well. But you can. But oil is fine. Cobalt mines are fine. Where do you draw that line of where regulation could beat politics and go in and say, we just won't accept this?
I think that one of the problems right now is that African leaders have not come together and established boundaries for the scramblers, whether it's over land, whether it's over diamonds, whether it's over oil, whether it's over coltan, which fuels our computers, our cell phones. And the Chinese have a strategy. Other countries, India is a major exporter of Africa diamonds, one of the major exporters of Africa diamonds. I think if African leaders came together through the regional organizations and made some boundaries for the exploitation of African resources, then we could begin to see a change in what's going on. But I'm not sure that they're willing to do that.
But the current state of affairs that you describe somewhat pessimistically, what does that breed socially, in your opinion? What's going on with the trust of the ability to do something together and actually have a society?
Well, one of the things that we do know is that if you read a book entitled China Safari that was published in 1989, that the Chinese government specifically said that we need to export about 3 million Chinese to Africa because of the growing population in China. So you're having more and more conflicts. As he mentioned, the Chinese live by themselves. So you're having more Chinese who are getting killed. You have Chinese who are killing Africans. So there are a lot of upheavals. Anytime you have large groups of people coming in and not integrating into a society, you just have a lot of problems. And I know I present a pessimistic picture of what's happening in Africa right now, but I've been on the ground researching this a long time. And it's hard for me. I'm not going to not tell the truth of what I'm really seeing. And it's a very dangerous situation, and especially because our African leaders are not taking the responsibility to control what's going on. But another dynamic of this is that, like you have in the Congo, you have so many different militia in the Congo. So it's not just the African leaders. You have militia groups who are fighting among themselves for these resources. There are new discoveries every day of oil, gas, etc. And people who are very poor are now involved in scrambling for these resources. You had in Zimbabwe a few years ago, in 2006, the discovery of a diamond mine. And once the government realized that this mine exists, they came in and killed all the people that were actually in the mine and working in the mine, pan mining, and took over along with Sampa and Queensway. So I think that, which is a predatory group that's serving as kind of a middle person, a middleman between China and Africa. So I think the situation is very, very deep, and it is very, very disturbing. And I can't tell you, because I teach it, I write about it, and I can't tell you that these things are not happening. This is the reality of what's happening, on the ground in Africa.
Is that what you see as well, doing your day-to-day work, Eric?
Well, I don't see that many confrontations, really, and I don't hear about them a lot in East Africa. But I mean, on village levels in some areas here where you find resources, definitely there are going to be people affected for sure. But there's always going to be a trade-off. We have had the same history in Europe and in Sweden, in northern Sweden, with our mining sector and whatever. Like, you're always going to have. There are people living everywhere, and these resources, rightly managed, they are extremely valuable for these nations. But the problem is to deal with it in a proper way. But the recent discoveries of oil in East Africa, for example, there are massive expectations within the populations on the income generated. I think it's even way higher expectations than, because it's not super high quality oil and not that many barrels found yet. But still, there's a lot of discussion going on about where to build the pipelines, and the only thing people want is to get it to the coast as easy as possible. But it's also, sure, most people, even the Sudanese oil, is going to Malaysia for refining and then coming back. And the same thing with Nigerian oil. You're also going to have to look at where do you get most bang for the bucks. And yeah, maybe it's technically, on the paper, it might make sense to send the resources away for refining and coming back. But eventually you are going to have to change from that extraction to actual refining the product within the economy. And that's a big challenge. Then you need to start building infrastructure within the continent, for example, not only extraction-based networks. But yeah, it's a big challenge, but I also want to stress that it's important not to just scare away investors. And a major responsibility lies with the governments, and that's a big problem. I spoke about it this morning, the problem of bad leadership, And we can't really, I don't know, it has to come from within, demands on the leaders to handle these resources properly. But it's a tricky situation.
I think really offshore refining of petroleum product is a way to export some part of the pollution, because refineries are extremely polluting and very harmful to people who live near them. So if more of African oil is refined abroad, that is good for Africa.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
No, but
but one thing I want to say.
But it makes sense though with what you're saying before, that's a way of measuring
is that
quality.
Truth? Yeah. I don't want a refinery near where I live because it's very toxic. In the U.S., fence communities living next to refineries in Berkeley area, where is that? In San Francisco, they're really very poisoned communities, and everywhere this is the situation. So maybe all of Africa should really be refined somewhere else. But You know, talking about political leadership, I do agree that political leadership is a big issue, but again, there's been very many externally generated destabilization on the continent. We've got leaders on the continent who really had their heads on their shoulder and who were really understanding the African context, who wanted to change things positively and to grow the African economy to meet the needs of the people. Someone like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, someone like Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau. We've got them. We've got Lumumba in Congo, and all these guys were assassinated because there was a need to keep Africa divided, destabilized, so that exploitation is much easier when the political leadership is not focused on the internal defense of the territory and the resources. And there are also some businesses who are known as sovereignty entrepreneurs. I read about one American company who was, they speculate on which African countries are going to break up and which part of the nation, when they split up, will be more beneficial for investment. And so these kind of corporations actually work directly to speed up the breakup, to destabilize countries so that they can invest in the friendly part of the country. Like what happened in Sudan, for example. Some countries were already grabbing land in southern Sudan, some corporations grabbing land in southern Sudan, so that once Sudan was split into two, they could invest because the government of South Sudan will be friendly with their own country. So the problems in Africa is not just an African problem, it's a global economic, capitalist domination, or all the geopolitical things. It's just that it's a playground where all this unfortunately plays out. And I do agree that the way out of this bind would be for people, African peoples, to really, really wake up, to challenge the political system, and let's have people like Thomas Sankara once more leading the nation.
So even though how much I wish that we had a big international African audience watching this is mostly Swedes, mostly Europeans watching this. What can we do as ordinary people to contribute in a positive way to this development? Is there anything that we should bear in mind at all?
Well, I know this university is attempting to develop stronger ties with Africa. I think that at this point, one has to be very careful in terms of the way you go in. My talk this morning was about the unsung heroes. There are a lot of people who are doing a lot of good things in Africa who are not presidents of African countries. And I think these are some of the people that the university should attempt to work with and develop further what they are trying to do to make a difference. I spoke about a university that's been a liberal arts university, the first one that has been established in Ghana, and the president is very committed to leadership, to training young people and making them understand about the privilege of leadership. There's also an academy in South Africa in which this is taking place. So I want to say that there's hope for the young, I think, if such academies can really produce people who are seriously committed to developing the continent and not just amassing wealth.
What would Erik say? Is there anything on the consumer side we can do?
Well, first of all, buy a ticket and travel around yourself. You know, that's the first step to actually go out and exploring this continent, because it's quite rewarding for any traveler. But I mean, then it's also, we have a globalization of food. You know, people could easily, I mean, in any store today in Sweden, you can pick whatever you want. You know, from any country. It's not only European produced stuff, but also, even if you're buying, for example, your cell phone, you know, I know my friend Lennart here spoke about the clean phone, you know, like, you can make sure as a consumer, but that goes for a lot of products already. We already want declaration of the content inside of a lot of stuff we are buying, and that goes, a lot of us can't even afford any conflict diamonds, you know. It's not even an issue that to buy clean diamonds, but when you're buying your cell phone, you could just make sure that the company providing your product might not use maybe coltan produced in a mine with child labor, which I've seen in Congo. But then also you have certified mines as well with some kind of regulation. But yeah, sadly you don't have so many consumer products being produced yet. But also when you're going to if you're using a car, you know, you want to make sure that the petrol, I mean, 30, 40 years ago, Shell and BP used to have a quite weak brand in Scandinavia because of the history in Nigeria. But now it's more like you just go to the gas pump, you know, and fuel up. So kind of, a level of knowledge among consumers about what is the origin, but yet it's still raw resources coming out. So you're gonna have to do a lot of research, or using environmental organizations, for example. They are doing a lot of work in Africa.
So
Amnesty,
you look to them to get the best advice.
Yeah, I mean, Amnesty was releasing a report just the other week about the environmental situation in the Niger Delta, for example. So, and a lot of people are members of Amnesty International here. They get the newsletters, everything. So, just engage. You know?
Just engage, which is always a good advice. We are on the hour, so we are going to close this evening's webcast, this broadcast. Thank you so much for watching. Those of you who are here in Lund may very well stick around after we close the webcast, because these guys aren't going anywhere fast. And if you wanna catch them on their way out and have some more discussions, then you are more than welcome to do so. To just stick around. We'd like to thank you all for watching, and thank you all for coming tonight, and a warm hand for this fantastic panel.